You're squatting in the dirt, gripping a knotted rope hung from a roof beam, and every muscle in your body is on fire. It's roughly 5,000 years before anyone writes anything down. There's no anesthesia, no sterile gloves, no monitor beeping out a heartbeat. There's just you, two other women holding your shoulders, and someone chanting words meant to keep away whatever bad luck causes babies to get stuck. This is childbirth, unmedicated, unfiltered, and terrifyingly common. And here's the question that should bother you more than it probably ever has. Statistically, a huge number of women who tried this did not walk away from it. So how did the rest of us get here at all? How did the species survive an event that for most of its existence was one of the deadliest things a human body could do? Here's the destabilizing part. Birth is dangerous for humans in a way it just isn't for almost any other animal, and the reason is baked into your skeleton. Somewhere around 2 million years ago, our ancestors made a trade. Bigger brains meant smarter tool use, better cooperation, and eventually, well, YouTube videos about childbirth.
But bigger brains need bigger heads, and bigger heads have to somehow fit through a pelvis that also has to stay narrow enough to walk upright efficiently. Anthropologists call this the obstetrical dilemma. Basically, evolution handed humans an anatomical contradiction and said good luck. Human babies are born less developed than almost any other primates, essentially evicted early, because staying in any longer would mean nobody makes it out. So right from the start, human birth was a genuinely risky bottleneck, and for most of the last 300,000 years, there was no hospital, no epidural, and absolutely no concept of germ theory. Speaking of which, here's a scale check for you. Germ theory, the idea that invisible organisms cause infection, is only about 160 years old. If human history were a 24-hour clock, germ theory shows up in the last 30 seconds. For basically the entire runtime of our species, nobody knew why wounds went bad, why fevers followed birth, or why some women just never got back up. And yet, generation after generation, humans kept surviving it. Not by luck, by an enormous, quietly brilliant, mostly female body of accumulated knowledge that almost never gets any credit.
Let's talk numbers, because they're wild. Historical and modern pre-industrial population studies estimate maternal mortality often sat somewhere around 1 to 1.5% per birth. That sounds almost survivable until you remember that a woman in most historical societies wasn't giving birth once. She was doing it 6, 7, sometimes 10 times across her life. Stack that risk up over 8 deliveries, and you're looking at a lifetime chance of dying in childbirth that could climb past 10%. Picture a revolver with just one bullet loaded among 50 chambers, and you're required to pull the trigger 8 separate times over your lifetime. That's roughly the gamble. And this wasn't a footnote of history. This was, for most of human existence, the single leading cause of death for women of reproductive age. Given stakes like that, you'd expect our ancestors to throw everything they had at the problem, and they did. This is where the story gets genuinely impressive, because what humans built in response to this danger wasn't superstition dressed up as medicine. A huge amount of it actually worked. The word midwife comes from Old English, meaning literally with woman, someone who stays beside you. And midwifery isn't a modern invention layered onto ancient ignorance. It is almost certainly one of the oldest specialized professions humans ever developed. Older than agriculture, older than writing, possibly older than most tools we consider defining of our species. Positioning turns out to be one of the earliest and smartest interventions. Across wildly unconnected cultures, from ancient Egypt to Mesoamerica to sub-Saharan Africa, women gave birth upright, squatting, kneeling, or sitting on specially built stools, using gravity as an unpaid assistant. This wasn't guesswork. Upright positions genuinely widened the pelvic outlet and shortened labor, something modern obstetric research has circled back around and confirmed. The fancy medical word for a birth attendant, obstetrician, comes from the Latin obstetrix, the woman who stands in front, not beside, not behind, in front, ready to catch. Ancient people built an entire professional identity around the physical act of positioning yourself to help. Then there's pain and complication management, and this is where it gets almost eerie.
Traditional midwives across cultures used raspberry leaf preparations to tone the uterus before labor, something modern herbalists still recommend and that has some documented physiological basis. They used massage to reposition babies that were sitting wrong. They understood, long before anyone had a word for hemorrhage, that steady pressure and specific herbal preparations could slow catastrophic bleeding. Some cultures used fermented or fungal preparations, including forms of ergot from infected rye, to help contract the uterus after delivery, a genuinely dangerous tool because too much of it could kill, but used carefully, it saved lives that would otherwise have bled out. This is trial and error pharmacology, refined across thousands of years, with zero microscopes and zero margin for error. Here's where you'd expect me to say, but that's not even the wildest part, so let me actually earn something better than that. Some ancient societies were doing early surgical intervention. The word cesarean gets tangled up in myth. People love saying it's named after Julius Caesar, which almost certainly isn't true, since his mother is recorded as surviving long after his birth, and the surgery historically only happened when the mother was already dying or dead, an attempt to save the infant as a last resort. Ancient Indian medical texts attributed to the surgeon Sushruta, likely compiled sometime around the 6th century BCE, describe abdominal surgical techniques advanced enough that some scholars argue early Indian medicine was experimenting with obstetric surgery earlier and more systematically than almost anywhere else in the ancient world.
A living mother surviving a C-section, though, wouldn't become reliably possible until surgical and antiseptic techniques caught up, centuries and centuries later. Now here's a fact that should genuinely surprise you, because it flips the ignorant past stereotype completely on its head. In 2001, an archaeologist named Joseph Wegner was excavating a site at South Abydos in Egypt when his team uncovered something nobody expected: a pair of painted mud brick objects buried beneath the floor of a house, dated to around 1750 BCE, nearly 3,700 years old. They were birth bricks. Egyptian women in labor didn't lie down. They squatted on top of these bricks, using them as a physical platform, decorated with images of the goddess Hathor and protective figures meant to ward off danger during delivery. It's the oldest physical evidence of a birthing device ever found anywhere on Earth, and it proves that by the time the pyramids at Giza were already old news, Egyptian medicine had developed a specific, purpose-built piece of equipment for one of the most dangerous moments a human being could face. It's worth pausing on how much support surrounded these births, because solitary childbirth was almost never the goal. Multiple women, sometimes across generations, would attend a single birth, some holding the laboring woman upright, some managing the newborn, some purely there to talk, distract, and reassure. Modern clinical research on something called continuous labor support, basically just having a calm, experienced companion present through delivery, shows it can meaningfully reduce complications and even shorten labor.
Turns out the instinct our ancestors had to never let a woman go through this alone wasn't just kindness. It was, unknowingly, evidence-based medicine thousands of years before anyone ran a clinical trial to prove it. And it wasn't only about the birth itself. Ancient societies developed surprisingly specific reproductive knowledge around spacing pregnancies, because too many births too close together was its own death sentence. The North African city of Cyrene built enormous wealth around a plant called silphium, now extinct, which ancient writers describe as a contraceptive and early pregnancy terminator so effective and so valuable that it appeared on the city's own coins. Whatever this plant actually was botanically, the demand for it tells you something huge. Ancient women and the healers who served them weren't just reacting to birth, they were actively managing fertility as a survival strategy, trying to control the terrifying math of how many times you could safely roll those dice. Written medical knowledge eventually caught up to and formalized a lot of this oral tradition. The Kahun gynecological papyrus from Egypt, dated to roughly 1800 BCE, is the oldest surviving medical text specifically about women's reproductive health, containing diagnostic techniques and treatments for conditions related to pregnancy and fertility. Centuries later, the Greek physician Cyrannus of Ephesus, writing around 100 to 130 AD, produced an entire manual called Gynecology, detailing labor management, newborn care, and even ethical guidance for choosing a midwife, essentially the ancient world's version of a hospital training manual. And nearly 1,000 years after that, in 11th century Italy, a woman named Trotula of Salerno, associated with the medical school at Salerno, wrote what's considered one of the most influential works on women's medicine in medieval Europe, The Diseases of Women, at a time when formal medical authorship by women was almost unheard of. The knowledge didn't vanish between ancient midwives and modern hospitals. It got written down, refined, and passed forward, by hand, for millennia. Here's the part that should actually give you chills,
because it's not abstract, it's one specific person. At the Neolithic settlement of Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, occupied starting around 7500 BCE, archaeologists working with Stanford researcher Ian Hodder's excavation team uncovered a burial that stopped everyone in their tracks. A young woman had been buried with the remains of a fetus positioned in what researchers identified as a breech position, meaning feet or buttocks first instead of head first, one of the most dangerous complications a birth can have, even today with a full surgical team standing by. She had died with the baby still inside her, in a settlement that had every tool, every ritual, and every attendant that its culture had developed over centuries to prevent exactly this outcome, and it still wasn't enough. Nearly 10,000 years later, her bones are the closest thing we have to a face on a statistic. She isn't a percentage.
She's a person, and her death is the exact reason every birthing brick, every raspberry leaf tea, every squatting stool, and every midwife's steady hand existed in the first place. All of it, the entire accumulated weight of ancient obstetric knowledge, was built as a wall against exactly what happened to her. And that's really the whole story, isn't it? Every practical trick, every herbal remedy, every architectural object like that Abydos brick, every written manual from Ceraunus to Trotula was humanity's slow, collective answer to a threat that never stopped being real. Nobody had a germ theory. Nobody had imaging. What they had was observation, repetition, and an absolute refusal to let women go through this without support. That refusal, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of years and uncountable individual births, is arguably one of the most consequential unspoken achievements in the whole human story. Every single person alive today, everyone who has ever lived, exists specifically because someone somewhere in some firelit room or mud brick house figured out just enough to get one more birth through to the other side.
So think back to that fire again. That grip on the rope, the women holding your shoulders in the dark. It wasn't ignorance in that room. It was 10,000 years of hard-won, whispered-down knowledge standing between one woman and the single most dangerous night of her life. And more often than you'd expect, it worked. You are, quite literally, the end result of an unbroken chain of successful outcomes to the most statistically dangerous thing the human body does. If you had to face that moment with nothing but what people knew 10,000 years ago, no hospital, no epidural, just a rope, a stool, and someone holding your hand, do you think that knowledge would have been enough to get you through? Let me know in the comments.